Hello, my name is Dr. Catherine McGregor, and I'm the Acting Dean from the Faculty of Education at the University of Victoria. It's my pleasure to join you here today, but before we get started, it's important that we acknowledge the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples and the Indigenous communities of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic peoples, whose stewardship and governance of these lands continues to this day. As a white settler, it's my privilege to work on acts of reconciliation and learning through my colleagues at the University of Victoria, particularly Indigenous colleagues who have helped me to understand my role as a colonizer and the ways that I too can support reconciliation. Today, I'm here, however, to give an introduction to a good colleague and friend, Dr. Fred Chou. Fred Chou is an assistant professor in counseling psychology in the Educational Psychology and Leadership Studies Department at the University of Victoria. Dr. Chou is a registered psychologist, but he has very much important areas of research focus in which he works with graduate students and undergraduate students to explore, including intergenerational trauma and resilience, Asian mental health, participatory action research, narrative research, developmental trauma, community and cultural psychology, and youth mental health literacy. Today, Dr. Chou will talk to you about the narrative themes of Chinese-Canadian intergenerational trauma. I'm looking very much forward to his conversation and the ways we can learn together about intergenerational trauma and anti-Asian racism.
Thank you for this introduction. It's such a wonderful opportunity to be able to share this research. The research that I'm going to be focusing on is, as in the title, the collective narrative themes of Chinese-Canadian intergenerational trauma. As was introduced, my name is Dr. Fred Chou. I'm a registered psychologist and assistant professor in counseling psychology. I appreciate the land acknowledgement that was also provided. I also want to acknowledge that where this research was located was in the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam Nation, where I had a chance to do this research at the University of British Columbia during my doctoral studies. So as kind of the purpose of today, my focus is really to try to tell the story of this study. Just like as kind of indicated in this title, this is about narratives. This is about storytelling. And I think it's very fitting if I also kind of focus on kind of telling what it's like to engage in this type of research and what does that mean in terms of the academic work that I'm doing today. I also want to acknowledge that there have been a large community that's supported this work. So I want to acknowledge Dr. Marla Buchanan, Dr. Marvin McDonald, Dr. Marv Westwood, Carmen Huang, and Vincent Ng. And just kind of a last point, because given that you're going to be watching this digitally, so you could kind of use whatever you need to kind of take pause or whatever. This is a study about trauma, intergenerational trauma. And so some of the stuff may be deeply personal, some of the stuff may kind of, you might find yourself being impacted by. And so if you find yourself being impacted by that, feel free to pause it, or if you need to kind of step away or kind of skip over certain sections, please do so for your own kind of well-being and self-care. You know, it takes work to engage in this type of topic. And I'm also encouraged, if you're watching this right now, that you're kind of choosing to learn about this topic and allowing it to affect you in ways that are healthy and helpful. And again, if you need to kind of take a step back, feel free to do so. Just want to also let you know, if you're interested in learning more about this, there have been some publications on this. And so the presentation that I'm doing right now is going to be a summary of some of this work. So if you're really keen, you could feel free to take a look for yourselves. To really just kind of start this off, I want to just tell a little bit of my own story that really kind of inspired the work of looking at intergenerational trauma in the Chinese-Canadian community. It kind of starts off with my grandfather. My grandfather is a significant part of my life. I grew up in a kind of a multi-generational household and an immigrant family. And so my grandfather was a really significant part of that. Because my parents had to work many jobs, as immigrant parents, he had a significant role in terms of raising us, raising myself and my siblings. So he is a significant part of this particular story, and part of the reason why I really got into this particular topic. And so, just to kind of wind back many, many years, back in 2007, we had a chance to go to China. And this was the first time my parents had a chance to go back to China. They'd migrated here in the 1980s and had not had a chance to go back. And so in 2007, some of you may kind of remember, this was the period before the Beijing Olympics. So there was a lot of, national pride and wanting to, a lot of people kind of going back to kind of see where they were from. And this was significant to go back and see, the countryside, to see, this idea of the Hunha, where your family is from. And during that time, my grandfather was quite unwell, unfortunately. So he couldn't make this trip back. And I think in his lifetime, he's only gone back once. And so this was a time when he unfortunately couldn't go back. And I remember during that time, this feeling of wanting to just get him something significant and something that was meaningful. And in my own kind of naivety, kind of made this thought of, at that time, what did I associate China with? What did I associate my heritage with? It was communism, Mao. And so I figured maybe let's get him a little red book. And I remember, you could find these, it's pretty easy to find them at the market stalls, but I remember just kind of wanting to purchase one. And remember this feeling of, there was no confirmation, from my parents. No, I remember kind of looking at my mom and, there's no confirmation, but there's also no indication that I should. And it was just a little bit of kind of an odd moment that stuck with me, this kind of hesitation. So I remember purchasing this, and when we went back home, trying to find the right time to give this to my grandfather, but I decided not to, because that feeling was still there. It kind of lingered. I remember then putting this into a dresser and kind of forgetting about it for a time, and coming back occasionally and just wondering if I should give this to him. But again, that same feeling kind of lingered. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe there's something here that might not seem the most appropriate. Fast forward several years later, and this was when my grandfather had passed away, and he had passed away when I started my PhD. And this was quite an impactful loss. As I mentioned earlier, this was an individual who was very much a father figure growing up. But when he passed away, I learned a lot more about the things that he'd gone through. I learned about the struggle sessions, which were these public humiliations that he'd gone through. I learned about many other things. And it was kind of shocking. Here I was, somebody who was doing their PhD, focusing on trauma, had done my training as a counselor, worked with traumatized individuals, and didn't really connect the dots to my own family. I'd done many family genograms, and again, this doesn't make sense to me. And to really kind of think about this idea that perhaps my grandfather was traumatized, and beginning to kind of think about those memories of, him experiencing night terrors and trying to raise, trying to kind of wake him up during those times, and again, not connecting the dot earlier on. And so it really began to make me wonder why no one really talked about this. Why nobody in my family talked about it. Why nobody in my Chinese Canadian community, my friends, my family friends, no one talked about this idea of trauma or these experiences of historical trauma. I began then to, part of the story behind this as well is just my grandfather was also part of the Kuomintang government. So that was the government that was overthrown by Mao's government. And so this feeling of what could have been if I'd given this to my grandfather, what kind of implications would have that meant, and how would that have impacted him? Knowing full well of my own naivety, of my own disconnection to history, and the implications of such an act. And how come nobody stopped me? And so, because I was in psychology, I really wanted to kind of figure out these types of questions. I really wanted to kind of understand, was there a particular construct that could explore this, and it really kind of led naturally to this idea of intergenerational trauma. And it really kind of made me wonder, a lot of things that I thought, maybe it was just, just because I'm from a Chinese immigrant family that my parents behaved this way. Maybe it's because of, these things that I thought was frugality or thought of emotional distance. Maybe it was just, things that I just thought were just Chinese, or at least my version of what I thought was Chinese. Maybe there's a facet of this that was also trauma as well. And so it led me to this question of asking, what are the narratives of intergenerational trauma amongst Chinese Canadian families? What are those experiences that impacted the first generation, the parent generation? What are those aspects in which how individuals construct their narratives through the ways that trauma gets transmitted? How did the subsequent generation make sense of this? And so I want to just now jump a little bit in terms of the different components of intergenerational trauma. And it's one of those really unique constructs because in psychology, our tendency is to just focus on the individual. And intergenerational trauma is one of those constructs that span generations. It's not this this singular thing. It is a relational construct. And so when we look at intergenerational trauma, we're looking at these components: degree of traumatization, the parental generation, transmission of trauma, and the behavioral and experiential outcomes on children and subsequent generations. There is different dynamics that can contribute to the transmission of trauma. And one of the prominent writers on this, Kellerman, argued that this is a weaving of different theories. You have psychodynamic, attachment-based theories, where the trauma may affect the ways in which a parent may connect and attach to their own children, social-cultural dimensions, the broader discourses that shapes in our understandings of people, the ways that affects family systems and how trauma is communicated, or in my case, not communicated, and the biological and epigenetic basis of trauma. And when you look at the research, it's this really extensive research base. The origins of it came from the Jewish Holocaust. And when you look at a lot of the really good work now, there's a lot of indigenous scholars looking at Indian residential schools, as well as other cultural communities. There's this really significant tome written by Yale Donnelly that incorporates a whole bunch of these broad collective traumas and historical traumas and tries to explore these different topics for these different cultural communities. But what's interesting is that in that tome, which is about 1,000 pages, there was nothing about Chinese intergenerational trauma. And that was a little bit odd. That despite our understandings of the scale of these types of things, the types of historical events, there was nothing written about Chinese intergenerational trauma. And so it really made me wonder why that was the case. And it brings up this topic of this idea of this conspiracy of silence. And this conspiracy of silence is this construct that Yale Donnelly observed when she was researching that phenomenology of Holocaust survivors, that their experience related to the Holocaust was that of silence. Silence from their own family, silence from professionals who were working with them who didn't necessarily believe what they had gone through, and silence around a broader community. That part of trauma isn't just the traumatic events itself, that it was also this post-victimization traumata of silence. And so Yale Dr. Donnelly coined this idea of this conspiracy of silence. And it really makes me wonder if there's also a little bit of this as well as we look at the Chinese Canadian community around this particular topic. Part of it, when we also think about trauma, there's silence that's related to trauma. And that could be oppression. Although there's a lot of questions about, could silence just be about oppression? Could it also just be about culture? Could it also be a form of resistance? And so as I reflect about my own family history, perhaps there's aspects in which trauma may have contributed to a silencing But there may have also been an aspect of it being a benevolent act from my grandfather, who decided not to share these types of experiences as well. So there's a lot of nuance when we begin to think about this idea of silence. In terms of looking at intergenerational trauma around the experiences of the Chinese Canadian and the Chinese community, it's not to say that there hasn't been work. It's just there hasn't been work from this construct of intergenerational trauma. I'm coming from psychology, and it seems like in the area of psychology that there has not been much work. It's not to say that there hasn't been work in terms of other disciplines, but for some reason in my discipline there has been very little. In terms of the research, there's only been, from my understanding, 2 other publications, actually 2 other research studies, and the work that I've been doing has been kind of the other one. And the first one was a dissertation, which was an autoethnography around experiences of intergenerational trauma for second generation folks. And the other one was around the Cultural Revolution, which was work that was done together with, I believe, the Freud Institute in Germany, with some scholars in China around the Cultural Revolution, experiences related to that. But this would be then the study that I'm presenting, the first one that includes both parent and offspring generation, looking at the Chinese diaspora around this topic of intergenerational trauma. But it's kind of interesting, as I mentioned, that there is a lot of this silence. And yet, when you look at the history, in terms of the 20th century history of China, one could argue that there have been some really grand scale historical and collective traumas. What I've kind of presented here is a very brief summary, simplification of some of the really significant events that could have had implications in terms of collective experiences around trauma. You had the revolution in 1911, which formed the Republic of China. You had civil war between Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party. You had the Sino-Japanese War, that's when World War II, between 1937 and 1945. Then you had the Civil War continue from that point, leading then to the communists kind of taking power, CCP, and then you had the Communist Revolution and others really kind of prominent policies that had large-scale effects, including the Great Leap Forward, class struggle, the Great Famine, and the Cultural Revolution. It's so important to note that just like as we think about parallels, as we think about Indian residential schools, that is just one particular event in a larger colonial project of other sorts of historical traumas. Part of the reason why that literature has kind of expanded, not just in terms of intergenerational trauma, but really expand to this idea of historical trauma, is really to kind of make this understanding that there has been many, many other events as well. And same thing when I refer to these types of experiences that individuals might have went through. The Cultural Revolution is one of those things that are really prominent and easy to identify, but is within a larger scale, a larger project as well of other types of events. And the estimates is, Great Famine, 45 million people died during that time, and estimates of 70 million people dying during this time from 1949 to 1975. And so one has to wonder, what kind of impact is that? I do also want to make a note that it's hard to discern this, because part of it is that there's different hegemonies that are playing into this. There's the American Western hegemony that wants to shape in terms of how we understand Chinese discourse, and then there's also the Chinese Communist Party hegemony as well. And so part of what I'm also kind of exploring is that the idea of what is considered to be trauma is also political, is also shaped by social forces. And it's also very difficult to discern what is exactly traumatic, given that it's also shaped by different political interests as well. And so, in my case, aside from all the politics, we have to also recognize that there was mass suffering during this time. And if we kind of strip away some of the politics, what I was really trying to understand here is this type of individual impact of these types of collective events that could be fit within this framework of intergenerational and collective trauma. And now, when we look at people's experiences, Chinese people's experiences in Canada, our history is also not that pretty either, unfortunately. And so we have the Canadian Pacific Railway, where There was kind of really cheap labor used, and also kind of putting people of Chinese heritage in really kind of problematic working conditions. Then there was the intentional disenfranchisement of Chinese and indigenous people in terms of registration and who was allowed to vote. Then there was the Chinese Immigrant Act that led to the Chinese head tax, where it was a particular ethnocultural group was being taxed because of what they represented, which was part of this larger discourse that was happening at that time in terms of xenophobia. Then led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, where intentionally a particular group of people was not allowed to come into Canada. And so this is also this history as well, when you look at the kind of modern, kind of 20th century history in China, and some of the incidents that folks may have gone through, as well as our history here in Canada as well. And some of the images that I present here is just the ways in which xenophobia was presented, and unfortunately has also kind of manifest as well in our current times as well. So, we think about the SARS, and that last image on the bottom right corner was a racist vandalism that was during the time of SARS. And unfortunately, there was also things that was happening during COVID-19 in terms of anti-Asian racism. And so this is also the histories in which we're looking at these types of experiences that frames potentially the narratives of intergenerational trauma. And again, when you think about the scale of some of these events, really makes you wonder why there has not been, at least in psychology, much work done on this particular topic. So, given the context of what we're doing with this particular study, and I do mean we, even though this was my dissertation work, I was supported by a community of people who I've named earlier, and my own family community. It was important to approach this from a trauma-informed perspective, and a perspective that didn't extract stories, that was really about ensuring the voices of participants was prioritized. And so we ended up deciding to use an approach called the collaborative narrative approach, which was really about an intentional process of working together with participants to tell the story that they want to tell, designed by Dr. Marla Buchanan. And this was, in my opinion, an approach to ensure that the agency of participants were prioritized, that it was intentionally done in a way to ensure that their voices were centered and done in a collaborative way. And so the approach that we did, there are multiple steps that are put in place to ensure we were properly consulting with the community. And so that first step, setting the stage, consultations with stakeholders, with the community, kind of being aware of what is it that we need to be aware of when we're approaching this particular topic. Multiple two consent forms as well, just to make sure whoever was getting into this particular study was aware of what they're getting into and how it may potentially impact them. And then once we found a participant, preparing them in terms of the types of questions, the type of materials, how the interviews were going to be set up. And so that next stage of co-constructing the narratives, we really saw it as something that we were doing together. And so this was an interview, and these were long interviews, 2 to 3 hours long. And if we needed a translator that was also part of that. My research assistant at that time was also a translator as well. And so not only did we have to take into consideration of trauma, we also wanted to take into consideration the ways in which language is so much abounded to the stories that are told. And so we used a multilingual research protocol for this. Once we had, and unfortunately I can't read Chinese, so it had to be translated into, the transcripts had to be translated into English, there was a multiple interpretive reading process where, as a researcher, I read for content, self as narrator, the research question, and relations to power and culture. Again, the aspect of consideration of power and culture was important. From there, once there was a bit of an interpretive focus, the stories were then written in a chronological and thematic way, but also to reflect that experience of receiving that story itself. And with the understanding that ultimately whatever gets translated into written form is never going to reflect that experience of talking to somebody about their story. From there, We had another interview with the participant, another 2-3 hour interview, where we presented the story and then we went through kind of rounds of kind of changing and modifying, removing, until they felt comfortable. And then we had kind of multiple conversations until they reached a point where they felt that the story that was being presented was the story that they wanted to share. This particular study, we had, we had a mixture of participants, and 4 of the participants actually came in 2 different respective families. So we had a father and a daughter, and a mother and a son. And so for those, we had an opportunity for them to share their stories to one another, where each person had a facilitated process where each person then had a copy of each other's stories. And we facilitated a process where they shared their stories to one another and shared what it was like to experience and hear each other's story. This was recorded and then given back to participants. Just to kind of give you kind of a broad kind of basis in terms of recruitment and inclusion, we intentionally looked at families that migrated, or individuals who migrated after 1967. This was when there were some changes to our migration policies in Canada. We focused on adult children, so offspring generation had to be over 19 years old. And for the parent generation, either the offspring could identify that their parent had gone through these types of experiences, or they themselves took part in the study, but there must have been some pre or post-migration trauma being defined in terms of your DSM-5 trauma, so near-death experiences or sexual abuse, or vicarious trauma in terms of witnessing near-death types of experiences, or it could be collective traumas, being large-scale traumatic events. With regards to, and so for those who decide to take part in this, either they must have experienced that themselves and have had an adult child, or it could be the adult child themselves who wanted to kind of take part in this because they identified that this was also what had happened to their parents. In terms of the participant group, we ended up having 8 participants take part in the study, and as I mentioned earlier, there was 2 family dyads. There's 1 individual who took part in this that was of the parent generation, that didn't take part with their child, and then 3 of them took part as kind of the offspring generation that didn't take part with their parents. And below we have the pseudonyms for the folks who took part in the study. When we developed these stories, each of those stories were roughly 20 to 25 pages long, which then kind of was documented. Ultimately, for our purposes, we can't ever fully kind of share all those stories because that would take quite some time. And so what I'm presenting here is just the themes. These are the narrative themes from those respective stories. Again, if you're interested in reading some of those stories, you could kind of look back at some of the publications or the dissertation itself. But please keep in mind that when we present themes, that there is a little bit of an extractionary quality to it because it does decontextualize some things. But what the intention of this is to share in a kind of a palatable way some of the commonalities across all the different stories that we saw here. And so first off, I'm going to cover off some of the experiences experienced by the parents. I'm going to go through each of these themes, and I'm going to present some quotes that are related to these themes. And the first one is the decimation of social structures. These particular themes most of them were related to specifically around events, some of the policies that were put in place, governmental policies, things like the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, etc., that had quite an impact on the participants. So please keep in mind that a number of these themes are direct references to some of those, just to kind of help contextualize it. But this particular theme was really about how their understanding of their social worlds were completely decimated and destroyed. That, the idea of honoring parents itself, which was so foundational to their worldview, was decimated, as well as other types of things in terms of Confucian relationships. And so these are some of the quotes that were presented. When I was 7 or 8, my older siblings had to write letters to government officials stating that they denounced my father and were cutting ties with him. I had to do this as well, but because I was so young, I did not understand the implications. There was no choice. You had to prove you were revolutionary. That is why many people betrayed their families and their parents. You were encouraged to betray your family, to set a clear dividing line between yourself and your family if they were considered bad, quote unquote, to show that you were one of the right people, the revolutionaries. The next theme is about oppression, chaos, and abuse. And again, these themes are interconnected. And so part of this, the social project at a time also led to experiences of oppression, experiences of this absolute chaos at the time. And this experience that how it kind of manifests at a macro level, but then also at a micro level as well in terms of what also affected them in their own individual families. This participant shared, the Red Guards ran amok in the city. They could just accuse and capture anyone. There was no court or police. They could just take you away because they thought you were a bad person, as was the case of my father. My father told me that as a kid, he saw a firing squad execute his neighbor. He told me that the firing squad lined up several people, including a young child, and executed them. These executions were public events to show other people not to be bad elements, quote unquote. That same family also had a young servant who killed himself by jumping off the building. The next theme then, as I was describing, these types of conditions really created quite a challenging environment. And then what the participants shared was that they had to engage in acts that sometimes went against their own moral code or their own ethic in order to survive. And some of these acts, more a reflection of the scale and extremity of the situations that they were experiencing. And so, Hua shares, my mother was afraid the Red Guards would come and accuse her of being anti-revolutionary for saving these items. She was talking about family heirlooms. So my mom did a very drastic thing, and she burned all the paintings, calligraphy, and books, even my father's academic books. These were very precious heirlooms, and she had to destroy them all. Her concern was our safety, but she always regretted doing that and cries when she talks about it. You never know when you will be attacked. And Miss Lin shares, in the village, baby girls were sometimes killed after birth. It was not that baby girls in general were being killed off, but if a family had no boys and more than one girl, they may feel they are in a disadvantaged situation. Therefore, they may kill the next child if it is a girl. It was sometimes out of necessity. And it's a bit of a difficult quote to read, but it's reflective of the types of circumstances that people were faced with. And obviously we could analyze that in different ways, but the point is that this was the type of situations that this, in some of the individuals' lives and in their minds, seemed like a rational choice at that time. Again, reflective of the circumstances people were facing. Theme 4, denied education and opportunities and personal losses. The participants shared about the centrality of education, that it was very much a part of their cultural identity. And so even though this seems fairly kind of minimal or not as kind of extreme as the other two themes, it was centrally important in terms of their own lives and their own experiences. And not only just the educational losses, but opportunities and a lot of their own significant personal losses because of the events that they had experienced. I tried every effort to become a student again, and every time, because my family background, I was turned down even though I was capable. That was the worst thing about being in the countryside. You could not see your future, and you couldn't do anything about it. It was mental torture. Henry shares, it broke my father's heart when I was sent to the countryside. It was the second time in my life I saw him cry. He said to me, "How can you live there? You're only 16. My heart wrenched when I saw my father cry. And the last theme is maintenance of values and emphasis on the future. And this is a theme around that either themselves or there were people in their lives that serves a protective aspect in their lives, that served a role of preserving them, their own resilience, and in that, maintaining their values, maintaining this focus on future orientation. Henry shares, there was so much injustice to the people who have contributed to shaping the country. It is unfair, and I knew that I had to leave for my children. I did not want them to experience not having opportunities and education. Hua shares, my mother always told me that sometimes doing the right thing meant sacrifice, and it was important to see the bigger vision. If my parents didn't teach me these principles, I might have done something terrible during the Cultural Revolution. After all, everyone was doing it. Education, integrity, and justice, these were the principles my parents instilled in me. So I'm going to now move over to the transmission themes. And the way that I've kind of connected it, more not necessarily, like it's not causative or not necessarily correlational because it's a different type of study, but more in terms of its thematic aspect. That the ways that these participants constructed their narratives, connected their dots themselves in terms of how trauma was transmitted and impacted, and what did it mean in terms of the consequential impact on their own lives as offspring, or how the parents may have interpreted the impact onto their children. And so it's important to know it's not causative, not correlational, but more of a kind of interpretation of how trauma was transmitted and its consequent impact. And what I did was kind of present different quotes from different folks in terms of how they understood transmission, and then connected with more thematically some of the consequential impact and linkage here. So the first theme, silence, shame, and disconnection. And so given the types of events that their parents had gone through, the offspring generation, and what they know of or may not have known of in terms of what their parents have gone through, there was a lot of silence. And because there was this sense of silence, there's almost this sense of shame and disconnection to family, and also disconnection to their own heritage. You know, why was there so much silence? And that silence kind of led to kind of interpretations, whether that be silence because it's wrong to ask about this, or silence because of the level of atrocity, or silence because it is just simply unspoken. So Ken shares, I'm not sure how long my father stayed in the labor camps, but I want to say 10 years. He has never described his experience to me. I don't have a close connection with my father, but I wish I knew more. And Stacy, kind of linking in terms of consequential impact. Without having access to my family stories, I sometimes feel at fault for internalizing racism and being disconnected from family. Theme 2 is about saving face and the cultural framework of interdependence. And this is this idea of, in understanding, whether or not necessarily in detail, but understanding something happened to their parents, there was this desire then to, in some ways, make up for it or protect their parents in some ways. And so it fits within this idea of filial piety, within this idea of saving face. But with that, then there was also this interconnectedness to it too, that they saw their own lives as being connected to their parents, even though they had lived different lives, that what their parents and what they've experienced was somehow connected to them as well. It reminds me of a quote from a conference that I attended from the Asian Canadian Asian Migration Studies. And this quote was, my pain is their pain and their pain is my pain. And really speaks to this idea of this interconnectedness in terms of experiences and lived experiences. Lena shares, it can seem like Chinese people are very monolithic. Oh, we are a good family. We have such and such accomplishments. We don't have flaws. Any issues are to be swept under the rug because it could ruin the image of perfection that we have to have. And Ryan, in terms of linking consequential impact, I'm still hesitant to tell my mother everything that is going on with my life because I'm afraid she might not completely understand my perspective, given that she grew up with very different values. And that quote, just to kind of expand it, it kind of speaks to this idea of almost wanting to protect his own mother from some his own experiences in some ways. With the third theme, this is about fear and discipline. And this is kind of a description of the ways in which some of that chaos, abuse, oppression that was experienced from the previous generation transmitted in some ways kind of led to certain types of disciplinary actions that were reflective of a fear of something might happen to them, to their children, even if that was not necessarily true, even though their children are in completely different contexts of their parents. But it's seen to, in some ways, as understood by the participants, manifest in this type of fear orientation and towards disciplinary actions that were much more strict. Joan shares, I just thought my mother was being a hard ass for no reason, but I realized she was really worried about me, my brother and I, and just wanted us to be stable and to be able to provide for ourselves. The lack of stability must have been very scary for them. And Stacy shares, as I was growing up, I thought the reason why I received physical punishment was because I was always messing up and doing wrong. I didn't see it as physical abuse because I thought I was at fault. The next theme is about education as survival and identity. And as I described earlier, education had this cultural value. But because of the loss of education, because of the scale of loss as well, there was almost this impression upon the subsequent generation that education was absolutely necessary, and for them, interpreted as a need to survive and interpreted as such a crucial aspect that it almost became part of their identity. Education was very important to me and my father. I think what makes me concerned for my daughter, and this was Henry, the parent, reflecting about the transmission to his children, is I think what makes concern for my daughter more prominent is because I'm reminded of my father and his wishes for me. One of the most tragic things for him was the future being taken away from his children, and maybe I fear that as well. Ken then describes some of the impact of which paralleled some of the other participants. The first year of university was tough. In fact, it was one of the toughest years for me because I wasn't ready for school. I failed the first year. I failed. My parents had extremely high expectations, and I was failing. I failed to meet their expectations. And it's kind of a parallel, this last theme, to the last theme of the parent's experience was there's this aspect in which values and heritage and culture was also being preserved. And so the theme was about preservation and this idea of reclaiming heritage. The participants, because for some of them there was this disconnection to their parents or to the history themselves, there was still this desire to understand their own heritage. And even though they didn't necessarily have as much direct means, they found their own ways to reclaim and connect to their own heritage. And so part of also the preservation was also the role of grandparents. Grandparents were a significant part of preserving, at least understood by the participants, had a significant role of preserving heritage and culture for these individuals. My son, and this quote from Ms. Lin, part of the interview with Ms. Lin, she kind of went into this space where it seemed like she was just sharing a message to her son, and so we wrote this section for her as a letter to her son. And so this was part of the message that she wanted to pass on to her son. My son, the Chinese have a saying, and I won't be able to read that, but the saying is, teach by words and deeds. It is a very important saying that my grandma taught me. I want to teach you through my actions and with my life as an example. And then Joan shares, as Joan as an offspring, like my parents, I too am helping other people. Now I find myself helping Chinese seniors. I can do this work because I speak Chinese and English, which couldn't or wouldn't be the case if it weren't for my parents. This work connects me with my heritage, connects me with the values my parents and grandmother have instilled in me. As I mentioned, part of the project also involved a family dialogue between the participants who take part in this as a family dyad or family pair. And so I also wanted to share kind of what it was like for them to share their experiences with one another. And so on the left side was Henry and Lena, and towards the end of the dialogue they shared, Henry being the father. She has grown. I can only see one side of what I experienced, but today I was able to see you and your feelings on your end. And the daughter, Lena, shared, and these were translated because they spoke to each other in Mandarin. I understand back in the day that you had lots of pressure and stress, and that was a problem of the country you could not do anything about. Now the pressure on you has gone down, and you have softened. And then on the other side, Miss Lynn and Ryan, Ryan being the son, Miss Lynn being the mom. Ryan shares, I hope you can have more time and chase your talents, and explore ways to express yourself. Because if this is your life's development, it's best not to lose it, but to turn it into something beautiful. I hope that you can give yourself more time to do things like these. And the mom shares, I now feel like my son has really grown up. He understands me and my ups and downs. And so this was really this really rich process towards the end of this project where these family pairs had a chance to share their experiences, and really quite an impactful aspect. Even though research, not designed to be a therapeutic intervention, itself had quite a benefit to the participants who took part in this, and quite impactful in terms of shaping their understanding of one another and understanding of their children and understanding of their parents. So I just want to wrap things up with just a little bit of a model to just kind of try to understand the many pieces that were presented here. And then from there, I'm going to kind of present what are some of the next steps from here, and how it's kind of shaping some of the work that I'm doing. This model has really been influenced by Dr. Robin Favouche, who developed this idea of this narrative ecology model, which kind of looked at it from an ecological systems perspective of the ways in which narratives get constructed and get shaped and get understood, from family, cultural narratives at a kind of broader macro level, to intergenerational narratives, to individual narratives. And so as I was looking at these particular stories and some of the dimensions related to it, part of the challenge and interesting thing is that, you could understand that this idea of Chinese-Canadian intergenerational trauma as a bit of a social construction. And in that, because of that, there is also kind of social and political dimensions that influence what is considered to be legitimate trauma. Part of the challenge in terms of studying this particular phenomenon is that we can't treat trauma as a universal semiotic of suffering. And this is a term that was written by Chidron, who does some research on this particular topic. That the challenge of looking at this, even though the offspring generation and us as academics kind of look at this as like trauma or cultural trauma for all these different types of terminologies, that may not necessarily be understood or be the frame of reference for the parental generation. And so there is a bit of a disconnect when we look at the parent generation and the offspring generation, where you have the offspring generation coming in with these kind of perspectives of mental health and trauma, which may not be the same in terms of how suffering is understood from the parental generation. Part of this was also this aspect of silence as well, and how much of that silence was related to trauma. Silence also from just really practical reasons, because linguistically there was language that was lost and not being able to explore and explain these types of experiences. But also silence in terms of a cultural value or acts of benevolence. And so silence was also a piece of this, and also taking into consideration that some of these events, and if you think about some of the broad social political aspects of it, may itself be silencing as well. So we have to take that into consideration in terms of the nuances and the messiness of looking at this particular study when we're looking at it from a narrative standpoint. Then the next piece is this intergenerational narrative pathways, and kind of seeing the commonalities in which trauma from at least these stories were transmitted from one generation to the next, and how there were some shared patterns between the two generations. And ultimately, kind of at the very end, this idea of intergenerational narrative identity and construction and resilience, where in the offspring generation, because of this large-scale events influencing their parents and trauma and individual trauma and collective traumas, there was this kind of sense of gap and silence and disconnection to their own heritage, but in their own ways, whether it be individuals who preserved their heritage or individuals who protected their own parents, found ways to also find ways to uniquely claim their own identity, their own cultural identity in their own unique ways. So what I want to end off with, and I just want to just note that, obviously there's a lot of strengths and limitations. Please also keep in mind that this is a qualitative study, that this was a narrative study, and so there are limitations. This can't be transferable, but it doesn't mean that there can not be resonance. So the power of narrative research is that there can be resonance, even if it may not necessarily be transferable or generalizable from a kind of a quantitative research standpoint. This was, as I mentioned, one of the very few studies that was done on intergenerational trauma and the Chinese diaspora. And my hope is, in doing this, it can kind of lead to more types of research around some really significant events, historical events, at least from a psychological standpoint, that researchers haven't really been looking at. And hopefully more research in terms of intergenerational trauma and the Asian Canadian spaces as well. Where this has led me, in terms of some of my work, I've continued to do some work around narratives and using kind of a similar approach with a funded project by the SSHRC, which is the Stories That Shape Us, Intergenerational Resilience in Chinese Canadian Families, so kind of the flip side of that other study. And in doing this, really seeing, as a therapist, understanding the value of stories and storytelling, but really kind of seeing it used in this cultural space. And so has also led to understandings of how do we adapt this to really think of it in a therapeutic means. And so there's 2 other studies that I'm also running. One of them is called Recultivating Family Stories, which is a self-facilitated guide for developing your own family stories for the Asian community, which is in the process of being piloted, as well as the Reclaim and Connect, which was a group that was designed originally as an intervention for addressing anti-Asian racism, and it's kind of shifted to focusing on guided storytelling for the Asian Canadian community to explore their own identity and racialized experiences. All my studies are kind of confusing because they all kind of sound like each other, but all of these are centered in the ways in which stories can be used in the Asian community and the Chinese community in ways that can be potentially healing and facilitative of healing opportunities. And the last thing that this work has really kind of led me into was developing a website, as you can see on the side there. And so my research team has been working on this website, which is a resource center for Asian Canadian communities around mental health. And so mental health is one of those things, as I mentioned, there's different discourses, and how do we begin to kind of create and share different types of resources that can be beneficial in terms of talking about mental health within the Asian Canadian community, as well as kind of connect different resources and research that's being done in this area. So I want to say thank you for taking time to watch this video. Thank you for the people who are recording here, my 2 audience members here. And really just thank you and encouraged for you for taking the time to watch this video and learn about this topic, and encourage you to continue to learn about this topic.